Hello everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day. Today, we're diving into a dramatic and intense story filled with betrayal, fire, and a shocking truth about family loyalty. What really happened the night Lynn set the farm ablaze? And why did Tu Tieu's own mother believe the villain instead of her own daughter? If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. That night, the sky hung low and heavy, the kind of pitch-black darkness that feels alive, like it's ready to swallow everything beneath it. Yuri and Tu Tieu's farm, usually peaceful and quiet, looked almost vulnerable under that kind of night. The wind whipped through the trees with an edge to it, sliding between the branches and making them rustle in a way that didn't feel natural. It was the sort of sound that tells you something is off, even before you know what it is. And that something was a person, a shadow, standing completely still behind the horse stable. It was Lynn. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't hesitating. Her posture was stiff, her jaw tight, and her eyes had a sharp, venomous shine. It was the look of someone who'd made up their mind long before this moment. Because for days, ever since Yuri accidentally stumbled onto her plan to take over his company, Lynn had been spiraling, terrified, cornered. Everything she had built, years of careful manipulation, of acting like the perfect adopted daughter, earning Mrs. Lon's trust, settling herself comfortably inside the family, was suddenly hanging by a single fraying thread. And that thread was Yuri. If Yuri exposed her, everything she'd invested into would burn to the ground. And that was something Lynn simply refused to let happen. In her mind, there was only one path forward, one brutal, irreversible path. The only person standing between her and total control of the company wasn't Yuri. He was too moral, too cautious, too suspicious. No, the real problem was Tu Tieu, the younger sister, the emotional core of the family, the one Mrs. Lon trusted more deeply than she ever admitted. As long as Tu Tieu was alive, Lynn could never truly take the reins. But if Tu Tieu happened to die in a tragic farm accident, and if Yuri happened to be caught in the chaos, well, then everything would fall neatly back into Lynn's hands. That twisted logic was exactly why Lynn was here now, clutching a gasoline can. She poured the fuel slowly, methodically along the wooden walkway. No hesitation, no trembling, like she'd rehearsed it in her mind 100 times. When she finally struck the match and flicked it down, the flames burst up instantly, hissing and snapping like they already understood her intentions. She stepped back a few paces and watched the fire latch onto the storage shed, then crawl hungrily toward the main house. To her, the flames weren't horrifying. They were liberating. But what Lynn didn't know was that Yuri wasn't asleep. Moments earlier, he had stirred awake because of a strange noise, something between a pop and a crack. At first, he thought it was a tree branch hitting the side of the house. But then a subtle, acrid smell seeped through the open window. Something thick, something smoky. By the time he saw the orange glow flicker across the wall, his stomach dropped. Tu Tieu! Yuri bolted upright, rushing straight toward her. Inside the bedroom, smoke was already creeping along the ceiling, dipping lower and lower. And Tu Tieu, who'd always had trouble breathing around smoke, was coughing weakly, barely conscious. Yuri didn't hesitate for a second. He scooped her into his arms and sprinted into the burning hallway. Bits of the ceiling crackled overhead, heat pressed against his skin like hot metal. But he didn't stop, not once. He yelled desperately for help as he ran, though he knew no one else was nearby. He just needed to keep shouting, to keep himself focused until they reached the outside. When he finally burst through the front door with Tutu in his arms, the night air hit him like ice. He barely had time to lay her down gently before grabbing his phone. He called the police first, then the fire department, giving the address in a frantic rush. Only once he was sure they were on their way did he force himself to run back toward the burning building to check for anyone else inside. Farmhands, workers, anyone. And that's when he saw it. Something was glinting near the ground, catching the reflection of the fire. Yuri crouched down and found a half-burned gasoline can lying on its side. But next to it was something even stranger, a silver bracelet. For a moment, he just stared at it, stunned. Then slowly, he picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. He recognized the design immediately. It wasn't a cheap bracelet, and there weren't many like it. He didn't say a word. He didn't call anyone over. He just closed his fist around it and turned back toward the burning house, eyes darkening. Hours later, after the responders finally extinguished the fire, Yuri stayed by Tu Tieu's side as she was transported to the hospital. She didn't wake until almost dawn. When she finally opened her eyes, the exhaustion on her face broke his heart. Once she was calm enough to speak, Yuri reached into his pocket and pulled out the bracelet. "Do you recognize this?" he asked quietly. Tu Tieu blinked, confused. Then her breath caught. "This is Lynn's bracelet. I bought this for her birthday last year. Why was it at the fire?" She wasn't angry. She wasn't suspicious. She was just genuinely baffled, unable to connect the dots. But Yuri saw the whole picture. He didn't tell the police about the bracelet. He didn't tell them about the gasoline can. He simply reported the fire as a likely accident. And that wasn't because he believed it. It was because he needed time to think, time to gather evidence, time to be absolutely certain. A plan was forming, piece by piece, in the back of his mind. When Mrs. Lon and Lynn heard about the fire, they rushed straight to the hospital. Mrs. Lon practically collapsed onto Tu Tieu's bedside, crying and fussing over her daughter's bruised voice and tired eyes. Lynn stood behind her with the sweetest expression she could muster. But her eyes weren't smiling. There was a flicker of irritation, maybe even fury, that Tu Tieu was still alive. "My dear sister, I was so worried," Lynn said softly, placing a hand over her heart. But Yuri noticed her other hand, a hand that was noticeably bare. The missing bracelet was proof enough, and as he watched her, his silence wasn't fear, it was preparation. His eyes no longer carried their usual warmth. Instead, there was a sharpness, an unwavering determination, because Yuri knew something with absolute clarity. A quiet war had just begun, and he would be the one to bring the truth into the light, no matter what it cost. In the days that followed, the hospital room became a stage, one where every character played a role, though only a few understood the real script unfolding beneath the surface. Tu Tieu spent most of her time resting, drifting in and out of sleep as the stress and the smoke slowly left her system. Mrs. Lon stayed by her bedside almost constantly, fussing over her pillows, adjusting her blankets, and offering warm soup that she insisted would help her regain strength. To any outsider, it looked like a picture-perfect moment of maternal devotion. But Yuri wasn't an outsider. He was watching everything. The way Mrs. Lynn clung to Tu Tieu. The way Lynn hovered close but not too close, offering just enough care to appear loving while keeping her eyes sharp and calculative. And every time Lynn's gaze flicked toward the door, the hallway, or the nurses, it was never out of worry. It was caution. She was checking for risk, checking whether the police were coming to ask questions, checking whether someone had discovered something they shouldn't have. Because in Lynn's mind, the fire should have solved everything. And yet, here she was, forced to act, forced to pretend, forced to plaster on a smile, while the very person she tried to kill rested comfortably in a hospital bed. It made her sick. Yuri saw all of it, but he didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he continued gathering information quietly, watching, measuring, memorizing. He wanted proof that couldn't be denied, proof that couldn't be twisted, proof that would finally reveal Lynn's true intentions, both to the police and to Mrs. Lynn, who was painfully blind to the truth. One morning, when Mrs. Lynn stepped out to buy breakfast, and Tu Tieu had fallen back asleep, Yuri decided it was time for the first step of his plan. He turned to Lynn, who was pretending to read a magazine. "Walk with me," Yuri said calmly. Lynn froze. For a moment, her fingers tightened around the glossy pages. She didn't want to go anywhere with him. But refusing would raise suspicion, so she forced herself to nod and followed him out of the room. The hallway was quiet. Only the hum of hospital lights filled the air. Yuri stopped near a window overlooking the parking lot. No one else was around. Lynn swallowed. "Is something wrong?" Yuri reached into his pocket and pulled out the bracelet, the same silver bracelet she'd lost the night of the fire. Her breath hitched, just barely, but Yuri saw it. "You dropped this," he said, his voice low. Lynn's expression didn't crack, but her pulse visibly jumped in her neck. I don't know how it got there." Yuri stepped closer. "I found it next to a gasoline can." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Lynn opened her mouth to speak, but Yuri raised a hand. "I'm not telling the police," he said. Her eyes widened, not with relief, but with confusion. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I want to hear the truth from you," Yuri replied. "I want to understand how far you're willing to go, and I want to give you one chance. One, before I decide what comes next." Lynn felt cornered. Every instinct told her to lie, deny, twist the narrative. But something about Yuri's eyes, they weren't soft. They weren't pleading. They weren't even angry. They were calculating, studying her, judging her, waiting. And that terrified her more than being caught. She forced out a laugh, brittle and sharp. "Yuri, you're misunderstanding everything. Fires spread in strange ways. I probably dropped it days ago without realizing. You're trying to connect dots that aren't even part of the same picture." Yuri didn't blink. "Then why did you fill out a withdrawal slip at the bank 2 days before the fire? Why did you request full control of the company accounts? Why did you confront the board without consulting me, claiming I agreed to give you temporary power?" Lynn's face drained of color. He knew. He knew everything. And yet, he still hadn't turned her in. For a moment, panic rippled across her features. But then, as quickly as it came, it vanished. Her expression hardened, becoming something cold and sharp. "You think you know everything," she whispered, "but you don't understand what you've taken from me." Yuri remained silent. "You think Mrs. Lynn sees me, but she only sees her precious daughter. I've worked for years to prove myself. Everything I did was to survive, to earn a place in a world that was never meant for me. Her voice trembled at the edges, not with sadness, but with anger. And now? Yuri asked quietly. Now, Lynn said, her eyes flashing, I take back what should have been mine. Yuri didn't respond. He simply turned and began walking back toward the hospital room. Lynn stayed frozen in that hallway, chest rising and falling with quick breaths. She had revealed too much. And Yuri wasn't going to stay quiet forever. Something had to be done. Back inside the room, Tu Tieu stirred awake, just as Yuri sat down beside her. She blinked at him, noticing the tension in his shoulders. Are you okay? She asked softly. Yuri forced a small smile. I will be. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the truth either. It was simply the only thing he could say for now. Later that afternoon, 2 police officers arrived at the hospital, not because Yuri called them, but because they were updating the victims about the fire report. When Lynn saw them through the window, her heart stopped. She immediately shifted her demeanor, stepping closer to Tu Tieu to look supportive and caring. But Yuri watched her with narrowed eyes. The officers delivered standard information. The cause was still undetermined. An investigation would continue, and they might need statements later. But then one officer added, We did find signs the fire might have been started intentionally. Lynn's fingers dug into her own palm. Hard. Yuri didn't react outwardly, but inside, he knew this was his chance, his opening. He let the officer finish, nodding politely. After they left, Lynn excused herself quickly, claiming she needed air. But Yuri knew exactly what she was doing. Running, planning, scrambling. And he also knew this. She wasn't finished. The silent war he expected was already underway, and the next move would be hers. But Yuri had something Lynn didn't. Patience, proof, and the benefit of time. He was going to expose the truth. And when the final moment came, Lynn wouldn't be the one in control. Yuri would. The story follows a tense and tragic night at a family farm, where Lynn, driven by desperation and jealousy, sets the property on fire in an attempt to eliminate Tu Tieu. Lynn believes that removing Tu Tieu is the only way to save the farm and secure control of the company. Meanwhile, Tu Tieu becomes trapped in the burning building, unaware of the betrayal surrounding her. Yuri, her husband, rushes through the flames to save her, risking his own life. The emotional conflict deepens when Tu Tieu's mother, Mrs. Lynn, who raised Lynn as an adopted daughter, chooses to believe Lynn's lies instead of trusting Tu Tieu. As the truth unravels, loyalties fracture, hidden motives rise to the surface, and the family faces a devastating turning point shaped by deception, fire, and the desperate struggle for power and survival.